Peace be with you, dear friends. In this session, which is the second part of chapter 5, we are going to encounter Jesus, who is going to chart out 6 fundamental, radical ethical principles that his disciples should follow, encompassing all spheres of relationship with God and with one another. And they deal on questions of anger, adultery, divorce, oaths, retaliation, and the hatred of enemies. These 6 varied topics will tell us the righteousness of Jesus vis-a-vis the righteousness or the legal practice of the scribes and Pharisees. And each of the statements starts with a technique called contrast, which we shall call as antithesis. It begins like this. You have heard that it was said to those of olden days. So the disciples of Jesus have read or heard it explained in the synagogue services, what God told the people of Israel on Mount Sinai, given by Moses. And the second part is what we call the antithesis. Jesus says, but I say to you, the Sermon on the Mount, you will come across this statement from Jesus 12 times to show the unprecedented authority of Jesus even over Moses. The purpose of these statements of Jesus, on the one hand, not to abrogate the law, but to express the deeper significance of God's law, and also at times to supersede the old law given through Moses. The first issue is that of murder. The gospel says, you have heard, you shall not murder. But I say to you, if you are angry, etc. Jesus goes to the root of the matter, and he forbids anger and insult that lead to murder. So the radicality of Jesus is highlighted here. Put away anger which causes murder. And the punishment is as Gehenna, will be sent to Gehenna, or the hell fire, which is translated as hell fire. Gehenna is the Hinnom valley outside the city of Jerusalem, where the waste of the city was burned 24/7, and everyone who listened to Jesus knew about this place, which resembled the hell fire. So Jesus is not making a distinction between more serious sin or less serious sin. Anger is as sinful as murder itself. And there is, again, fraternal reconciliation should take precedence over sin, sacrifice and worship. So reconciliation, coming from Latin, cilia, eyelash to eyelash, that reconciliation should precede sacrifice. Secondly, the question of adultery. Jesus again goes to the root cause of adultery. It is lust that leads to adultery. Sin committed is first in the heart, and heart in the biblical term is the organ for taking decision. So to drive home this point, Jesus uses a technique called hyperbole, an exaggerated statement that should not be taken literally. Jesus is not telling us to cut off our eyes or hands, but not to entertain anything that would lead to adultery. Thirdly, the question of divorce. Mark, Luke, and St. Paul are unanimous in understanding the teaching of Jesus on marriage, the indissolubility of marriage, and the prohibition of divorce. Matthew seems to make an exception in this gospel. He says, no divorce except in the case of chastity. Except in the case of unchastity. Is Matthew giving an exception to his community? Looking at the semantic value of the Greek word porneia, it would suggest that Matthew is dealing with his context. A text is to be understood in its context. Matthew's community consisted of a minority Gentile Christian community that joined them with incestuous union. So according to Mosaic law, a man should not have incestuous union, which is in the case even of Matthew's gospel makes the marriage invalid. And fourthly, the issue of oaths. Do not swear falsely. Jesus said, do not swear at all. Oath is an attempt to control God by calling Him to witness. Jesus wants His followers to be truthful and honest in the speech. And fifthly, the question of retaliation. The Old Testament law of retaliation sounds inhuman. Instead, the original intention of the Mosaic law was to restrict revenge and to keep violence within its control. Remember, Moses was instructing a group of tribal community, the Israel, who would take revenge 7 times. So Jesus directs His followers to non-violence and non-retaliation. Is it utopian? Practical? We can look at the life of Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, who took these precepts of Jesus seriously, and they have proved that it's practical. And finally, the question of love of enemies. Loving the neighbors means in the Bible, members of the same family or community, nation. But Jesus says, love your enemies as well. And pray for those who persecute you. Again, utopian? No. The early Christian community practiced it, as we know from the example of Saint Stephen. And what's the basis? Example of the Father. Friends, I would ask you to go through this part of the Sermon on the Mount closely and locate 17 times the Father is mentioned as my Father, your Father, our Father, because in this whole section we find the centrality of Father, and that's a clue to understanding this Sermon on the Mount. Till then, Shalom.